Another article here related to cocoa and chocolate and cocoa substitutes. So from June 14th, 2024, Elaine Watson. Title of the article is Mez Foods turns to mesquite as skyrocketing cocoa prices drive interest in chocolate alternatives. The article begins. Cocoa prices are currently in the stratosphere, with an imbalance between supply and demand exacerbated by everything from volatile weather to pests and disease, illegal mining and land degradation, aging trees, and investor speculation. And that's before you address ethical and environmental challenges variously associated with the crop, from deforestation and the high water footprint to child labor, says Mez Foods co-founders Bob and Ben Schultz, who started exploring alternatives early last year. While some startups are using upcycled coffee grounds and grape seeds to replicate cocoa, Chicago-based Mez Foods has homed in mesquite, a leguminous tree with pods that can emulate some of cocoa's qualities, but can also take center stage as an ingredient around which to create a brand. Although mesquite looks similar to carob, an ingredient that's been used in alternative chocolates for decades, especially in Europe, they are completely different species, says Bob, a food scientist who most recently worked at alt-protein startups Simulate and Aqua Cultured Foods. Carob is part of the Ceratonia genus, while mesquite is part of the Prosopis genus, although they are both in the Fabaceae family, along with soy, peas, and other legumes. He adds, the Spanish term algarrobo is carob, and they initially and mistakenly called mesquite beans the same thing. In parts of Mexico, they call it mesquite, but in many parts of South America, they still call it algarrobo, despite it being a misnaming. Turning mesquite into a household name? According to Ben, when we first started Mez Foods early last year, we were initially in the mind that we needed to create a brand to showcase mesquite to consumers through something that would play like chocolate and occupy some of the same use cases, but over time would create its own distinct category offering new flavors and experiences. And that's still the goal of our consumer-oriented brand, to try to turn mesquite into a household name that stands on its own, not as a chocolate alternative, says Ben, former director of product management at Peloton, with a background in sales, operations, and supply chain management. But with soaring cocoa prices driving industrial chocolate players to more actively explore cocoa and chocolate alternatives, he says, being able to offer wholesale options for bakers and other chocolate buyers looking to reduce or replace their cocoa-based chalk started to look like an equally attractive proposition. We had intended that the B2B side of our business would be our second phase, but we're actually in the process of considering making that our primary focus, and for that to work, we need our product to taste as close to chocolate as humanly possible. The relatively underdeveloped nature of the mesquite supply chain is both one of our biggest opportunities and one of our biggest risks. A drought-tolerant tree that grows throughout Mexico and the southwest United States, South America, Africa, and Asia, mesquite has long, beige-colored pods that can be ground into flour and used in baking or as a seasoning. Mez Foods combines it with Ilipe butter, gaining traction as a palm oil and cocoa butter replacement. Chufa, tiger nut flour, fermented pea and rice protein, and a small amount of carob flour to round out the flavors of the mesquite beans to create its like chocolate but better bars. According to Ben, mesquite can grow pretty much anywhere, and there is an industry around cultivating it agriculturally and processing it for food ingredients. But right now, it's fairly localized, and what's tending to happen is that these trees are growing wild, and landowners are typically working with various organizations to essentially forage the trees. He adds, we see the relatively underdeveloped nature of the mesquite supply chain as both one of our biggest opportunities as a business and one of our biggest risks. So when we talk about risk, we're still trying to determine the full extent of what the current supply chain of mesquite can meet from a capacity standpoint. The opportunity is that we see an ability to really grow this agricultural system using modern technology and trade practices. If you grind up the entire pod, including the skin and seeds, the flour has 40% plus protein and a significant amount of fiber, says Ben. If you just grind the flesh, the kind of mesquite flour Mez Foods is currently sourcing, it's slightly lower in protein. We've been experimenting with all different forms and suppliers from smallholder forages in Texas all the way down to more industrial sources in South America. But it's naturally very sweet with rich aromas of chocolate and cinnamon, but there's also some complexity with notes of toasted coconut and date. According to Bob, what's exciting is that there are multiple different species of mesquite with different flavor profiles. So some have a honeycomb kind of flavor, for example. Plus, through processing such as roasting, smoking, and fermenting, there are so many possibilities that we feel like we've barely scratched the surface in terms of flavor development. Consumer versus industrial business model. On the industrial wholesale side, you don't need to sell the argument for a chocolate alternative, notes Ben. Anyone buying cocoa or chocolate in bulk is actively exploring ways to reduce or replace it in some products given the recent surge in pricing. On the consumer side, it's a different ballgame, he says. As players in the meat alternative space are learning fast, many consumers do not know or do not care about the problems in animal agriculture they are trying to solve. And while they say they will pay more for a sustainable or ethical product, companies also need to offer an immediate consumer benefit. For Mez Foods, which started selling its wares at farmers markets before launching a direct-to-consumer business last year, that's both a novel ingredient and super nutrition with more protein and fiber, no dairy, and far less sugar than regular chocolate, which is often loaded with sugar to offset the bitterness of the cocoa, says Ben. We substitute we subscribe to this belief that you have to be an order of magnitude better than existing options in order to drive consumer change. And it's pretty hard to make something more convenient or taste better than chocolate. So we wanted to come up with a bar that you can love and eat every day that isn't going to spike your blood sugar and gives you 12 grams of protein, 6 grams of fiber, and only 12 grams of sugar without using high-intensity sweeteners or sugar alcohols. On the industrial side of the business, the Schultz brothers are talking to bakeries and other businesses that currently buy chocolate to assess their interest, says Ben. We did a small pilot with a bakery in Chicago, and some of our syrups are making their way into some local Chicago businesses, but we're just starting conversations with larger companies to see what their appetite is for this. Mesquite as coffee alternative? To date, Mez Foods is self-funded, says the brothers, who are subleasing a chocolate-making facility in Chicago and now exploring outside investment options. We are just starting to talk to investors as we look at the opportunity in the ingredient sides of the business. We actually see potential for venture capital in a way that we didn't see when we were primarily trying to build a consumer brand. According to Ben, what's interesting is that mesquite is also a potential alternative to coffee, which is also facing significant supply chain challenges. In fact, one of the larger users for mesquite in South Africa is a decaf coffee alternative, inspiring some U.S. startups such as Kamana. End of article. This article is extremely informative, extremely well written, and the background of the co-founders is actually quite interesting as well. So they intended to create a brand. They intended to start with mesquite as basically the foundation of their business model. They didn't want to try to create a chocolate alternative. They really wanted to essentially create a different vertical, a different niche, if you will, a different lane altogether, which would be embracing either the carob tree or the mesquite tree, which are similar but still different. And they've realized that they wanted to go direct to consumer, and now they see that there are B2B plays going to other producers of end goods versus going to create a brand and going direct to retail and in supermarkets and convenience stores and gas stations. So the problem, it seems, though, is that on the sourcing side, they said that most of their sourcing is foraging. And this tree is weather hardy. It's drought resistant for the most part, and it's spread across the North and Central and South America, in addition to Africa and Asia. But there's no consolidation, so it's similar to other industries where there's really no incumbent farming plots of trees themselves as standalone players for direct harvest. But having said that, there's many benefits, it seems, where through the powder, the milling down of the pods in as a whole, there's a lot of fiber, there's a lot of protein, which outstrips cocoa, apples to apples. And then it mentions that there's less sugar needed versus cocoa, because cocoa could potentially be even more bitter. So I very much like the fact that they're trying to carve out a niche. I very much like the fact that they're trying to use these types of trees, which are really unknown to most folks. And then, of course, with the background, one of them comes from alt protein startup Simulate and Aquacultured Foods, and it seems the other one comes from Peloton, which is unfortunately a stock that seems to be going down to zero, having lost more than 99% of its valuation since Corona times in 2020. Um, but that's another story altogether. So great article, very very informative, and looking forward to seeing how they grow both in Chicago and beyond as a brand and as a supplier and a sourcer of the raw materials. And at the very end of the article, it talks about venture capital, and it says, um, we are just starting to talk to investors as we look at the opportunity in the ingredient side of the business. We actually see potential for venture capital in a way that we didn't see when we were primarily trying to build a consumer brand. So, according to Ben, so very interesting. And yeah, they're talking about coffee, potential alternative to coffee. So let's see. There's a lot of moving pieces here, but I can see a business play here that's quite clear, and looking forward to hearing future updates from this great startup. And really, so much progress already in just less than 2 years of up and running. So well done to both of these Schultz brothers.